Good evening and welcome. Tonight, let us slow things down and step quietly into a classroom that no longer exists. A place far removed from modern ideas of childhood, comfort, or emotional safety. Imagine a room filled with rows of wooden benches, the smell of chalk dust hanging in the air, and a heavy silence broken only by the scratch of ink on paper. This is not a story meant to shock for the sake of shock, but to gently guide you into understanding how education once looked when discipline mattered more than curiosity, and obedience mattered more than joy. Today's story begins with a simple idea that shaped everything else in Victorian schooling: the belief that children were not fragile minds to be nurtured, but raw material to be disciplined, shaped, and corrected. In Victorian England, education was not designed to help children discover who they were. It was designed to teach them who they were supposed to become. The classroom was a place of preparation for adulthood, and adulthood, in the Victorian imagination, was defined by endurance, restraint, and respect for authority. Childhood was not seen as a special phase deserving of gentleness. Instead, it was considered a temporary condition of disorder, something that needed firm control before it could cause lasting damage. Teachers were not expected to entertain, inspire, or emotionally support their students. They were expected to maintain order, deliver information, and produce obedient future citizens. From the moment a child entered the classroom, the lesson was clear. The room itself taught discipline before a single word was spoken. Hard benches discouraged comfort. Cold air kept students alert. Silence was enforced not just to prevent distraction, but to train children to suppress instinctive behavior. Fidgeting, whispering, or even shifting posture too often could be interpreted as a moral failure rather than a physical need. In this environment, learning was inseparable from fear, and fear was considered an effective teaching tool. Victorian society believed deeply in the idea that character was formed through hardship. Comfort, in their view, weakened the spirit. Too much kindness risked encouraging laziness or rebellion. This belief extended beyond the classroom into parenting, work, religion, and medicine. Schools simply reflected the broader values of the time. A strict classroom was not a sign of cruelty in Victorian eyes. It was evidence of responsibility. A teacher who ruled with authority was doing their duty, both to the child and to society at large. Education during this era was closely tied to morality. Academic failure was rarely treated as a neutral mistake. Instead, it was often interpreted as a sign of poor discipline, weak will, or flawed character. If a child struggled with arithmetic or spelling, the assumption was not that they needed help or a different explanation, but that they were not trying hard enough. Punishment was meant to correct not just the error, but the child's inner nature. Learning was not about understanding concepts. It was about training the mind to obey instructions under pressure. Teachers themselves were products of the same system. Many entered the profession with idealistic hopes, only to find themselves overwhelmed by overcrowded classrooms, long hours, and limited resources. They were expected to manage dozens of children alone, maintain absolute order, and meet strict expectations from school inspectors and parents alike. There was little room for flexibility or compassion. A teacher who appeared too lenient risked criticism or dismissal. Authority was their primary tool, and losing control of a classroom was considered a personal failure. This pressure shaped how teachers interacted with students. Patience was a luxury few could afford. Strict routines simplified classroom management, even if they came at the cost of student well-being. Rules were enforced consistently, not because they always made sense, but because consistency was believed to build discipline. Over time, this rigid structure became normal, and questioning it was rare. After all, this was how education had always been done, or so it seemed. The Victorian classroom was also deeply hierarchical. Teachers stood as unquestionable authority figures, and children were expected to comply without argument. Asking why was not encouraged. Obedience itself was a lesson. This hierarchy mirrored the wider social order, where class, gender, and age determined one's place in the world. Schools were training grounds for this structure, preparing children to accept their position without complaint. In this context, fear was not seen as harmful. It was seen as motivating. A child who feared punishment would behave, study harder, and learn faster, or so the thinking went. Emotional discomfort was considered temporary, while the benefits of discipline were believed to last a lifetime. Modern ideas about mental health, stress, and emotional development did not exist in the same way. There was little understanding of how constant anxiety could shape a child's sense of self. Victorian education also placed a strong emphasis on uniformity. Individual differences were inconvenient. A classroom functioned best, according to this philosophy, when every child behaved the same way, followed the same rules, and progressed at the same pace. Creativity, imagination, and personal expression were secondary concerns, if they were concerns at all. The goal was not to help each child thrive in their own way, but to produce a predictable, manageable group. This belief in uniformity extended to teaching methods. Lessons were repetitive, memorization-based, and rigidly structured. Rote learning was valued because it was measurable and controllable. Recitation, copying, and repetition allowed teachers to quickly assess obedience and attention. Understanding was less important than correct performance. A child who could repeat information accurately was considered successful, even if they did not fully grasp its meaning. Over time, this system reinforced itself. Children learned quickly that survival depended on blending in. Standing out, whether through enthusiasm or confusion, attracted attention, and attention often led to consequences. Many learned to appear attentive without engaging deeply, to follow rules without questioning them, and to suppress curiosity in favor of compliance. These habits, once learned, were difficult to unlearn. Looking back, it is easy to judge Victorian education harshly. From a modern perspective, the lack of emotional support and the emphasis on discipline over understanding seem deeply flawed. But within its historical context, this system made sense to those who built and maintained it. Victorian society valued order, productivity, and moral restraint above all else. Schools reflected these priorities, serving as institutions of social conditioning as much as places of learning. This is why the Victorian classroom feels so foreign today. It was not designed for comfort, creativity, or emotional safety. It was designed to prepare children for a world that demanded endurance and conformity. Education was not a journey of self-discovery, but a process of shaping behavior. Every rule, every routine, and every punishment reinforced the same message: to succeed, you must control yourself, obey authority, and endure discomfort without complaint. As we move deeper into this story, it becomes clear that everything else in Victorian schooling flowed from this central belief. The punishments, the uniforms, the routines, and even the strange medical practices all served the same goal. They were tools used to manage childhood itself, to mold restless, curious minds into quiet, compliant ones. Understanding this foundation helps explain why Victorian education looked the way it did, and why it left such a lasting impression on those who experienced it. So as we continue, keep this idea in mind. Victorian classrooms were not chaotic or cruel by accident. They were carefully structured environments built on the conviction that discipline created virtue. In a world that feared disorder and valued control, the classroom became a place where childhood was not celebrated but corrected. And it is from this starting point that the rest of the story unfolds. If discipline was the soul of the Victorian classroom, then stillness was its most visible expression. From the moment lessons began, children were expected to sit perfectly upright, feet flat on the floor, backs straight, hands neatly folded or placed precisely on their desks. Movement was not just discouraged. It was interpreted as a sign of inner disorder. A restless body suggested a restless mind, and a restless mind was believed to be morally suspect. Victorian educators placed extraordinary importance on posture. Sitting correctly was not simply about physical alignment or preventing discomfort. It was viewed as a reflection of character. A child who slouched was not merely tired or uncomfortable. They were seen as careless, lazy, or lacking self-control. Upright posture symbolized discipline, respect, and readiness to learn. The body, in this sense, became a tool for moral training. Classroom furniture reinforced this belief. Benches and desks were rigid, often mismatched to children's sizes, and offered no ergonomic support. Comfort was not a design goal. In fact, too much comfort was considered dangerous. Victorian thinkers feared that ease would encourage idleness, and idleness was viewed as a pathway to moral decline. Mild physical discomfort, on the other hand, was thought to strengthen willpower and focus. Children were expected to remain still for long periods, sometimes for hours at a time. Lessons involved copying text, listening silently, or reciting memorized material. There were few breaks, and physical movement was tightly controlled. Even small, natural adjustments, stretching a leg, shifting weight, or turning the head could draw attention from the teacher. Repeated movement marked a child as troublesome, regardless of intent. This expectation ignored basic human needs, especially those of children. Young bodies naturally seek movement. Stillness requires effort, particularly over extended periods. Yet Victorian education treated this effort as a valuable exercise in self-mastery. Learning to override physical impulses was considered preparation for adult life, where long hours of labor and strict social rules awaited. Teachers closely monitored posture as part of classroom discipline. A child might be corrected publicly for leaning too far forward, resting their chin on their hand, or allowing their shoulders to droop. These corrections were not always gentle reminders. They were meant to reinforce the idea that the child was being watched and judged, not just for academic performance, but for physical conduct. Posture drills were sometimes used, especially in larger schools. Children would be instructed to sit, stand, and move in unison, reinforcing uniformity and obedience. These exercises blurred the line between education and training. The goal was not individual comfort or health, but collective order. A classroom where every child sat identically was seen as a successful classroom. This obsession with stillness also shaped how children experienced learning internally. When so much attention was focused on the body, the act of learning itself became secondary. Many children learned to prioritize appearing well-behaved over engaging with the lesson. Concentration was often directed toward maintaining the correct position rather than understanding the material being taught. Silence and stillness worked together. A quiet, motionless classroom was considered ideal. Noise and movement suggested chaos, and chaos was feared. Teachers were praised for maintaining calm, orderly rooms, even if that calm was achieved through tension rather than genuine engagement. From the outside, such classrooms appeared efficient and controlled. Inside, many children experienced them as restrictive and exhausting. The emphasis on posture also reflected broader Victorian social values. Proper posture was associated with respectability, particularly in the middle and upper classes. Standing and sitting correctly signaled self-discipline and social awareness. By enforcing these standards in schools, educators were preparing children not just for work, but for their place in society. The classroom became a rehearsal space for adult behavior. Over time, these expectations shaped children's self-perception. Those who struggled to remain still often internalized the idea that something was wrong with them. They were labeled inattentive or poorly disciplined, even when their behavior was entirely natural. Meanwhile, children who could suppress movement were rewarded, reinforcing the belief that self-denial was a virtue. In this way, posture and stillness became powerful tools of control. Without a word being spoken, children learned that their bodies were subject to authority. Every ache ignored, every urge to move suppressed, was a lesson in compliance. The body was trained first, with the assumption that the mind would follow. Understanding this aspect of Victorian education helps explain why the classroom felt so rigid and unwelcoming. It was not just the rules or the punishments, but the constant physical restraint that defined the experience. Children were not only taught lessons from books. They were taught how to occupy space, how to hold themselves, and how to exist quietly under watchful eyes. This relentless demand for stillness set the tone for everything else that followed. It made discipline visible, measurable, and enforceable. And it reinforced the central belief of Victorian schooling, that a well-controlled body was the foundation of a well-controlled mind. If stillness trained the Victorian child's body, silence was meant to train the mind. In these classrooms, quiet was not simply a practical requirement to allow teaching to occur. It was treated as a moral achievement. A silent child was seen as respectful, obedient, and properly formed. A noisy child, by contrast, was assumed to lack discipline, self-control, or seriousness of character. Silence in the Victorian classroom went far beyond refraining from talking. Children were expected to make themselves almost invisible. They were not encouraged to express opinions, share feelings, or react emotionally to lessons. Laughter, excitement, frustration, or curiosity were all potential disruptions. The ideal student absorbed information without comment and followed instructions without visible reaction. This expectation reflected a broader Victorian discomfort with emotional expression. Emotions were often viewed as something to be managed, restrained, or hidden, especially in public spaces. Schools reinforced this belief early. Children learned that showing too much feeling, even positive feeling, could attract unwanted attention. Emotional control was equated with maturity, and maturity was the goal of education. Classroom routines reinforced this silence. Lessons were teacher-centered, with long periods of listening or copying. Questions were rare and often discouraged unless explicitly invited. Speaking out of turn was treated as a breach of order, not a sign of engagement. Even when a child was confused, remaining silent was often safer than admitting uncertainty. Over time, many children learned to suppress their inner responses. Curiosity became something private. Confusion was hidden. Excitement was contained. The classroom rewarded those who could disappear into the background and penalized those who stood out. In this environment, learning became a solitary, internal process rather than a shared exploration. Teachers were trained to value quiet rooms. Inspectors often judged a school's quality by its level of order. A classroom full of silent children appeared efficient, controlled, and successful. Noise suggested failure. This external pressure encouraged teachers to prioritize silence over understanding. It was easier to manage a quiet room than to navigate discussion, emotion, or debate. Silence also created emotional distance between teachers and students. Relationships were formal and hierarchical. Teachers were authority figures, not confidants. Personal struggles, fears, or feelings had no place in lessons. A child's inner world was largely irrelevant to their education, as long as their outward behavior remained acceptable. This emotional suppression had lasting effects. Children learned early that their feelings were inconvenient. Expressing discomfort, boredom, or anxiety was unlikely to bring support and might instead bring correction. As a result, many internalized the belief that emotions should be endured quietly rather than acknowledged or addressed. The concept of invisibility extended to mistakes as well. Drawing attention to oneself by getting an answer wrong could be humiliating. Public correction was common, and the safest strategy was often silence. Some children learned to avoid participation altogether, choosing invisibility over risk. In doing so, they protected themselves from embarrassment, but at the cost of deeper engagement. This atmosphere shaped not only behavior, but identity. Children who naturally spoke more, asked questions, or expressed emotion were gradually trained to restrain those traits. Meanwhile, quiet compliance was praised and rewarded. Over time, the classroom sent a clear message about what kind of person was valued: calm, reserved, emotionally contained, and compliant. Understanding this emphasis on silence helps explain why Victorian education could feel so emotionally cold. It was not designed to support children's inner lives. It was designed to regulate them. By teaching children to be quiet and unseen, schools reinforced the idea that personal expression was less important than order. Silence, then, was not just the absence of sound. It was a tool. It shaped behavior, controlled emotion, and reinforced authority. Alongside stillness, it formed the foundation of a system that valued control over connection. And with bodies trained to remain still and voices trained to remain quiet, the Victorian classroom achieved its ideal state: orderly, disciplined, and emotionally restrained. Once silence and stillness had been established as ideals, discipline became the mechanism that kept them in place. In the Victorian classroom, discipline was not an occasional response to serious misbehavior. It was a constant presence, woven into the rhythm of daily school life. Children were reminded, again and again, that consequences were always nearby, ready to appear the moment order slipped. Discipline during this era was rooted in the belief that fear was an effective teacher. Educators assumed that children learned best when they clearly understood the cost of disobedience. Rules were strict, expectations were rigid, and enforcement was visible. The goal was not simply to correct behavior, but to prevent it from happening in the first place. A well-disciplined classroom was one where children regulated themselves out of anticipation, not understanding. Correction was often immediate and public. When a child broke a rule, even a small one, it was rarely handled privately. Public correction served a dual purpose. It addressed the individual child while also reminding the rest of the class of the consequences of stepping out of line. In this way, one moment of correction reinforced discipline across the entire room. This approach relied heavily on routine. Children quickly learned what behaviors were unacceptable and what responses followed. Predictability was key. The consistency of discipline made the system feel unavoidable. There was little room for discussion or explanation. Rules existed to be followed, not debated. Understanding why a rule existed was less important than obeying it. Teachers were expected to maintain absolute authority. Questioning a teacher's decision was itself considered a form of misbehavior. This reinforced a strict hierarchy where power flowed in only one direction. Children learned early that compliance was safer than resistance, and silence was safer than protest. The emotional tone of discipline was serious and formal. There was little attempt to soften corrections, or consider a child's emotional state. From a Victorian perspective, too much gentleness risked undermining authority. Discipline was meant to be memorable, not comforting. The experience itself was intended to leave an impression strong enough to prevent future mistakes. Over time, this environment trained children to constantly monitor themselves. They learned to anticipate rules, suppress impulses, and adjust behavior before correction was necessary. In many cases, discipline no longer needed to be actively applied, because it had already been internalized. The classroom became a space where control was largely self-enforced. This system also shaped how children understood authority beyond school. Respect for teachers was closely tied to respect for employers, religious leaders, and social institutions. Schools were preparing children for a world where questioning authority was discouraged and conformity was rewarded. Discipline in the classroom was practice for discipline in life. From a modern perspective, this approach appears emotionally distant and rigid. But within its historical context, it was seen as practical and responsible. Victorian society valued order, predictability, and moral restraint. Schools reflected these priorities, using discipline as a tool to mold behavior and character simultaneously. What is important to understand is that discipline was not viewed as a failure of education. It was considered an essential part of it. A classroom without visible authority was seen as ineffective. Control was proof that learning could occur, even if learning itself was narrowly defined. By embedding discipline so deeply into everyday routines, Victorian classrooms ensured that obedience became habitual. Children did not just follow rules. They absorbed them. And once discipline had been internalized, the system could operate smoothly, quietly, and efficiently. This constant presence of authority set the stage for everything else that followed in Victorian education. It shaped how children behaved, how teachers taught, and how learning itself was understood. Discipline was not just a response to disorder. It was the foundation upon which the entire classroom experience was built. Behind the authority of the Victorian classroom stood teachers who were themselves under constant strain. While they appeared powerful to their students, many teachers occupied a precarious position within the education system. They were expected to maintain perfect order, meet strict standards set by inspectors, and manage large groups of children with very limited support. Failure to do so could cost them their livelihood. Most classrooms were overcrowded, with dozens of students packed into small, poorly ventilated rooms. Teachers were often responsible for children of varying ages and abilities at the same time. Individual attention was nearly impossible. Under these conditions, strict control was not just a philosophical choice, but a survival strategy. Order made the workload manageable. Disorder threatened everything. Teachers were closely monitored by school authorities. Inspections were frequent, and reports focused heavily on discipline and appearance rather than student well-being. A quiet, orderly classroom reflected well on the teacher. A noisy or restless one suggested incompetence. This external pressure encouraged teachers to prioritize control above all else, even when they privately recognized the emotional cost to students. Many teachers entered the profession with good intentions. However, the system left little room for flexibility or empathy. Shown leniency could be interpreted as weakness. Allowing discussion or movement risked chaos. Over time, even compassionate teachers learned to suppress personal instincts in favor of strict routines. The role demanded consistency, not creativity. The emotional distance between teachers and students was reinforced by training and expectation. Teachers were instructed to maintain formality and authority at all times. Friendly behavior risked undermining respect. As a result, relationships remained distant and hierarchical. Teachers were not encouraged to understand their students as individuals, but to manage them as a group. Long hours and low pay added to the burden. Teaching was demanding work, often with little recognition or reward. Exhaustion was common. In this environment, patience became difficult to sustain. Discipline offered a clear, structured way to maintain order when energy and resources were limited. This does not mean teachers were universally harsh or uncaring. Many likely struggled internally with the demands placed upon them. But the system rewarded compliance, not reflection. Those who enforced rules efficiently were praised. Those who questioned methods risked criticism or dismissal. Over time, the role shaped behavior as much as belief. Teachers also served as examples of obedience themselves. They answered to inspectors, administrators, and rigid curricula. In enforcing discipline, they were demonstrating the same submission to authority that they expected from their students. The classroom thus became a chain of command, with pressure flowing downward at every level. Understanding the position of Victorian teachers helps explain why the classroom functioned as it did. The strictness was not solely a product of individual temperament, but of structural expectation. Teachers were instruments of a broader social system that valued order, efficiency, and moral restraint. In many ways, teachers were both controllers and controlled. They enforced stillness, silence, and obedience because they were required to do so. The classroom was a space where authority was performed daily, not just by students, but by teachers as well. This dynamic ensured that the system sustained itself. Teachers trained children to accept authority, while authorities trained teachers to enforce it. And so the cycle continued, shaping generations of students within the same rigid framework, where discipline was both the method and the message. As discipline, stillness, and silence became harder to enforce in overcrowded classrooms, Victorian society increasingly turned to an unexpected solution: medicine. During this period, the line between education, discipline, and health was blurry. Substances that are carefully regulated today were once openly marketed as helpful aids for focus, calmness, and proper behavior, even for children. Victorian medicine was built on limited scientific understanding and strong faith in authority. If a respected doctor, clergyman, or educator endorsed a tonic, it was rarely questioned. Many products promised to soothe nerves, improve concentration, and reduce what adults described as excessive energy. Restlessness was not viewed as a natural part of childhood, but as a condition in need of correction. These tonics were often given to children who struggled to sit still, remain silent, or follow strict classroom routines. The goal was not treatment in a modern sense, but management. A calmer child was an easier child to teach, and an easier child to control. In this way, medicine became another tool of discipline, working quietly where rules and routines sometimes failed. Advertisements of the time presented these substances as gentle and beneficial. They were framed as solutions for nervousness, distraction, or fatigue, conditions that Victorian society believed interfered with moral development. Parents and teachers were reassured that these products helped children become more attentive, obedient, and composed. The widespread acceptance of such remedies reflected a deeper belief that behavior could be chemically adjusted to meet social expectations. Instead of questioning whether classrooms were too rigid or demanding, society focused on changing the child. If a child struggled, the problem was assumed to lie within them, not within the system. This approach aligned perfectly with Victorian values. Self-control was prized, and any method that appeared to support it was welcomed. Chemical assistance was seen as no different from strict rules or posture drills. All served the same purpose, producing calm, manageable students who fit neatly into the classroom structure. Teachers, under constant pressure to maintain order, often supported these practices. A quieter classroom meant fewer disruptions and better inspection results. The effects of these substances were rarely questioned as long as behavior improved. Long-term consequences were not part of the conversation, because the immediate goal was compliance. What makes this practice especially revealing is how normalized it was. These products were not hidden or secretive. They were openly sold, widely advertised, and socially accepted. This normalization shows just how committed Victorian society was to controlling childhood behavior, even if it meant altering it through artificial means. For children, this added another invisible layer of control. Not only were their bodies trained through posture and stillness, and their voices restrained through silence, but their inner energy was also subdued. The classroom became a place where natural impulses were systematically reduced, replaced with calm, passive compliance. Understanding this aspect of Victorian education highlights how far the system was willing to go to preserve order. Discipline was no longer just external. It moved inside the body itself. And with this shift, the classroom gained yet another method of enforcing conformity, quietly reinforcing the belief that a good student was a controlled one in every possible sense. What made the use of early behavioral medicines especially powerful was not just their availability, but the voices that promoted them. Victorian society placed immense trust in authority. Doctors, educators, religious leaders, and publishers were seen as moral guides, and their endorsements carried enormous weight. When these figures supported calming tonics and focus-enhancing remedies, few parents or teachers felt any reason to doubt them. Advertisements played a crucial role in this normalization. Newspapers, pamphlets, and posters presented these products as responsible choices for caring adults. The language was reassuring and confident. These remedies were described as wholesome, restorative, and supportive of proper development. Rather than being framed as control, they were marketed as assistance, a way to help children meet the expectations placed upon them. The messaging often emphasized improvement in behavior and attention. A calmer child was portrayed as a healthier child. Focus and quietness were treated as signs of success, not just academically but morally. In this way, chemical calm became linked with virtue. If a product helped a child behave properly, it was assumed to be beneficial. Religious authority also played a subtle role. Self-restraint and obedience were widely preached as moral ideals. Anything that appeared to support these values fit neatly into the Victorian worldview. When endorsed by respected figures, these remedies seemed to align with both science and morality, strengthening their acceptance. Teachers, already under pressure to maintain order, welcomed anything that made classrooms easier to manage. Parents, anxious about their children's future prospects, wanted them to succeed in school and society. These shared anxieties created fertile ground for solutions that promised calm, focus, and conformity. What was rarely questioned was the underlying assumption that children needed to change in order to fit the system. The classroom itself remained rigid and demanding. Instead of adapting education to suit children's needs, Victorian society adapted children to suit education. Authority figures reinforced this idea by presenting chemical assistance as sensible and progressive. This normalization removed moral hesitation. If respected voices approved, then use felt responsible rather than extreme. Over time, these practices blended seamlessly into daily life. They became part of the background of education, rarely discussed, yet quietly influential. Understanding this helps explain how deeply control was embedded in Victorian schooling. It was not enforced by fear alone, but by trust. When authority figures agreed on a method, society followed. And so, chemical control joined posture, silence, and discipline as another accepted pillar of the classroom. By this point, the Victorian student was surrounded on all sides. The body was restrained, the voice was suppressed, the emotions were contained, and even inner energy was regulated. Authority was no longer just external. It was reinforced through belief, habit, and social approval. This widespread acceptance reveals a system that was remarkably consistent in its goals. Everything pointed toward the same outcome, producing quiet, compliant, and manageable children. And because authority figures agreed on this vision, it rarely faced serious challenge during the era. As we move forward, it becomes clear that these methods did not exist in isolation. They worked together, reinforcing one another, creating an educational environment where conformity was not just encouraged, but expected. As these practices became routine, Victorian classrooms began to measure success in a very specific way. A successful student was not necessarily one who understood ideas deeply or thought independently. Success was defined by compliance. Children who sat still, stayed quiet, followed instructions precisely, and caused no disruption were seen as model pupils. Their behavior confirmed that the system was working as intended. This definition of success shaped everything that followed. When a child became calmer, more focused, or more subdued after strict routines or external aids, the change was interpreted as improvement. There was little interest in what the child felt internally. Reduced movement, fewer questions, and quieter behavior were taken as clear evidence of progress. The system rewarded what it could easily observe. Teachers, inspectors, and parents all reinforced this perspective. Reports praised orderliness, neat handwriting, and obedient conduct. A classroom that ran smoothly reflected well on everyone involved. As long as children appeared attentive and controlled, deeper concerns remained invisible. Compliance became a shortcut for achievement. Over time, this created a powerful feedback loop. Methods that produced compliant behavior were repeated and expanded. Those that encouraged curiosity or individuality, but risked noise or movement, were avoided. The system learned from its own measurements, and those measurements favored control above all else. Children, too, learned what was expected of them. Many quickly recognized that following rules mattered more than understanding lessons. They adapted accordingly. Some learned to mimic attention without engaging. Others memorized information long enough to recite it, without forming lasting comprehension. The appearance of learning became more important than learning itself. This environment particularly affected children who did not naturally fit the ideal. Those who were energetic, curious, or emotionally expressive struggled the most. Their traits were not seen as strengths to be guided, but as problems to be corrected. When compliance was the primary goal, difference became a liability. Meanwhile, children who could suppress their instincts were praised and rewarded. They received approval, opportunities, and positive attention. This reinforced the idea that self-denial was virtuous and that comfort, movement, or expression were distractions from success. Over time, many internalized these beliefs, carrying them into adulthood. The system rarely paused to ask whether compliance truly reflected understanding. Order was visible and measurable. Curiosity was not. In a society focused on efficiency and control, visible order won every time. As long as classrooms looked calm and disciplined, deeper questions remained unasked. This interpretation of success also protected the system from criticism. If students appeared well-behaved and productive, there was little incentive to change methods. The absence of obvious disruption was taken as proof that education was effective. Silence became mistaken for learning. Understanding this helps explain why Victorian education remained so rigid for so long. The system rewarded itself. Every quiet classroom, every compliant student, reinforced the belief that strict control was not only necessary, but beneficial. The results appeared positive on the surface, even if the costs were hidden beneath. By redefining success as obedience, Victorian schooling ensured its own survival. Compliance validated the methods that produced it. And as long as compliance remained the primary measure, the system had no reason to evolve. Beyond rules and routines, the Victorian classroom used clothing itself as a quiet but constant lesson. School uniforms were not designed for comfort or self-expression. They were meant to erase individuality and remind children, at all times, that they were part of a system larger than themselves. What a child wore reinforced how they were expected to behave. Uniforms were typically stiff, heavy, and restrictive. Fabrics were coarse, cuts were rigid, and garments were often ill-fitting, especially for growing bodies. This discomfort was not seen as a flaw. It was intentional. Victorian culture believed that ease encouraged weakness, while mild discomfort built character. Clothing, like posture and silence, became another method of discipline. By dressing children alike, schools reduced visible differences between them. Individual identity was softened in favor of group identity. A uniform classroom looked orderly and controlled, which pleased inspectors and administrators. When everyone looked the same, it was easier to expect everyone to behave the same. Physical discomfort also served as a constant reminder of authority. Tight collars, heavy layers, and restrictive shoes made children constantly aware of their bodies. This awareness discouraged spontaneous movement and reinforced stillness. Running, stretching, or fidgeting became difficult, aligning perfectly with the classroom's demand for restraint. Uniforms also carried social meaning. They symbolized respectability, obedience, and moral seriousness. Wearing the uniform correctly was itself a form of behavior. A button left undone or clothing worn improperly could be interpreted as carelessness or defiance. Appearance became another area subject to scrutiny and correction. For children, this meant there was little escape from the expectations of school. Even before a lesson began, the uniform set the tone. It reminded them that school was not a place for comfort or individuality, but for discipline and conformity. The body, once again, was shaped to serve the system. This use of discomfort was consistent with broader Victorian values. Hard work, endurance, and restraint were celebrated virtues. Schools reflected these ideals by creating environments that demanded physical and emotional toughness. The uniform was a daily exercise in endurance, reinforcing the idea that personal comfort was secondary to duty. Over time, children learned to associate conformity with approval. Wearing the uniform properly and enduring discomfort without complaint became signs of maturity. Those who adjusted quietly were praised. Those who struggled stood out, often in unwanted ways. Understanding the role of uniforms helps reveal how comprehensive Victorian control truly was. Discipline did not begin with punishment or instruction. It began the moment a child dressed for school. Clothing, posture, silence, and routine all worked together, reinforcing the same lesson: to belong, you must conform. By embedding discipline into something as ordinary as clothing, Victorian education ensured that control was constant and unavoidable. Even in stillness and silence, the uniform continued its work, shaping behavior one uncomfortable moment at a time. Victorian education had little patience for difference. The classroom was designed around uniform behavior, and anything that disrupted that uniformity was treated as a problem to be corrected rather than a trait to be understood. Natural variations in how children thought, moved, learned, or expressed themselves were rarely accommodated. Instead, they were managed, restrained, or redirected until they fit the expected mold. One of the clearest examples of this mindset was how schools responded to children whose habits or abilities did not align with established norms. Rather than adjusting teaching methods, the system focused on reshaping the child. Difference was interpreted as defiance, weakness, or lack of discipline. The goal was not inclusion, but standardization. Learning styles were not recognized as a concept. All children were expected to absorb information in the same way, at the same pace, through the same methods. Memorization and repetition dominated instruction, leaving little room for visual, creative, or hands-on learners. Those who struggled were often labeled inattentive or careless, not differently wired. Even small deviations attracted attention. A child who preferred to write differently, solve problems in an unexpected way, or approach tasks creatively could be discouraged for failing to follow the correct method. Originality was risky. The safest path was imitation. Over time, many children learned to suppress their natural tendencies in order to avoid correction. This suppression extended beyond academics into physical behavior. Children were expected to move, sit, and act in identical ways. Individual rhythms, energy levels, or sensory needs were irrelevant. The classroom favored predictability over adaptability. In such an environment, difference became synonymous with disruption. The emotional impact of this was subtle but lasting. Children who repeatedly failed to meet expectations often internalized the belief that something was wrong with them. Rather than seeing difficulty as a mismatch between student and system, they saw it as personal failure. Meanwhile, children who naturally fit the mold were reinforced, not necessarily for understanding, but for compliance. Victorian society believed strongly in shaping character through correction. From that perspective, suppressing difference was seen as beneficial. The classroom was a place where individuality was refined away in favor of socially acceptable behavior. The end goal was not personal fulfillment, but social order. This approach also made the system efficient. A classroom that treated all children the same was easier to manage than one that adapted to individual needs. Efficiency mattered more than experience. As long as lessons progressed and order was maintained, the system was considered successful. Understanding this helps explain why Victorian education felt so rigid. It was not designed to discover potential, but to limit unpredictability. Natural differences introduced uncertainty, and uncertainty threatened control. So the system responded by narrowing acceptable behavior until only one version of the good student remained. By suppressing difference, Victorian classrooms reinforced the idea that belonging required conformity. Children learned early that acceptance came from fitting in, not standing out. And once that lesson was learned, it shaped not only how they behaved in school, but how they understood themselves long after they left it. Alongside rules, routines, and constant correction, Victorian classrooms relied heavily on public humiliation as a tool of control. The goal was not only to correct one child's behavior, but to warn every other child in the room. Mistakes were rarely treated as a natural part of learning. Instead, they were framed as failures that carried social consequences. Public correction created a powerful emotional lesson. When a child was singled out in front of their peers, the experience stayed with them. The memory of that moment often mattered more than the lesson itself. Fear of embarrassment became a strong motivator, sometimes stronger than fear of formal punishment. Children learned to associate errors with exposure, and exposure with discomfort. This approach shaped how children participated in class. Speaking up carried risk. Giving an incorrect answer could draw attention in the worst possible way. As a result, many children chose silence over engagement. Remaining invisible felt safer than attempting to learn out loud. Over time, this discouraged curiosity and experimentation, both essential to genuine learning. Public humiliation also reinforced hierarchy. The teacher's authority was made visible through the ability to judge and correct openly. The classroom became a stage where power was demonstrated. Each public correction reminded students who held control and who did not. Authority was not abstract. It was performed daily. From the Victorian perspective, this method served a moral purpose. Shame was believed to encourage self-reflection and improvement. If a child felt embarrassed, it was assumed they would work harder to avoid repeating the mistake. Emotional discomfort was framed as a temporary cost for long-term discipline. However, this practice also taught children to equate learning with risk. Instead of seeing mistakes as opportunities to grow, they learned to see them as threats to social standing. This mindset encouraged perfectionism and avoidance rather than exploration. Many students focused on not being wrong rather than understanding why something was right. The effects of this extended beyond academics. Being publicly corrected shaped how children viewed themselves in relation to others. Some became overly cautious, afraid to draw attention. Others withdrew, believing they were incapable. Meanwhile, those who avoided mistakes gained quiet approval, reinforcing the system's values. Public humiliation worked precisely because it was visible. One child's discomfort served as a lesson for the entire class. In a tightly controlled environment, this efficiency was valued. A single moment could restore silence and order more effectively than long explanations ever could. Understanding this aspect of Victorian education reveals how deeply fear was woven into everyday learning. Discipline did not rely solely on rules or routines, but on emotional memory. The classroom taught children not just what to learn, but what to avoid. By making mistakes socially costly, Victorian schooling shaped generations of students to prioritize safety over curiosity. And in doing so, it reinforced a system where obedience and caution were rewarded, while risk-taking and open inquiry quietly faded into the background. When all of these elements are viewed together, a clear picture of Victorian education emerges. The strict discipline, enforced stillness, silence, suppression of difference, public correction, and constant authority all point to one central belief: childhood itself was something that needed to be managed. It was not seen as a unique stage of life with its own needs, rhythms, and ways of understanding the world. It was viewed as an unfinished state, something unruly that required firm guidance before it could become useful. Victorian society did not romanticize childhood in the way later generations would. Children were expected to prepare early for adult responsibilities. Education was less about nurturing curiosity and more about shaping behavior. The classroom became a place where impulses were restrained, habits were formed, and obedience was practiced daily. Childhood energy, imagination, and emotion were not celebrated. They were filtered, narrowed, and redirected. This approach was consistent with the wider social environment. Life in the Victorian era demanded endurance. Work was long, expectations were strict, and social roles were clearly defined. Schools reflected this reality by training children to accept discomfort and authority without complaint. From this perspective, controlling childhood was not considered harmful. It was considered practical. As a result, the classroom focused more on what children should not do than on what they might become. Do not move. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not question. Do not stand out. Learning existed within these boundaries. Knowledge was delivered in controlled portions, through controlled methods, to controlled bodies. What was largely missing was curiosity about the child as an individual. There was little interest in personal interests, emotional states, or natural talents. A child's inner world mattered less than their outward behavior. As long as they appeared calm, obedient, and attentive, the system considered its job done. This mindset created an education system that was highly consistent, but deeply limited. It produced order, but at a cost. By prioritizing control over understanding, Victorian classrooms shaped behavior efficiently, while often neglecting emotional and intellectual growth. Children learned how to behave long before they learned how to think independently. Yet it is important to recognize that this system did not exist out of malice. It was built on the values and fears of its time. Victorian society feared disorder, moral decline, and unpredictability. Schools responded by creating environments where control was visible and constant. Childhood, in this context, was something to be shaped into submission before it could cause disruption. Understanding this helps explain why Victorian education feels so distant today. Modern perspectives place greater value on emotional well-being, creativity, and individuality. Looking back, the Victorian classroom can feel cold and rigid. But it also offers insight into how deeply cultural values shape education. By treating childhood as a problem to be solved rather than a phase to be supported, Victorian schooling left a lasting legacy. It influenced how discipline, authority, and learning were understood for generations. And while many of its methods have faded, the echoes of that mindset can still be felt whenever education values control over curiosity. In the end, the Victorian classroom was not just a place of learning. It was a place of shaping, narrowing, and conditioning. Childhood was carefully managed until it fit society's expectations. And in that quiet, orderly room, the lesson was always the same: to succeed, one must first learn to be controlled. To bring this story to a close, it helps to pause and look at the Victorian classroom as a whole, not just as a place of desks and lessons, but as a reflection of an entire worldview. Education during this period was never only about knowledge. It was about order, restraint, and preparation for a society that demanded endurance above all else. Every rule, every routine, and every expectation pointed in the same direction, shaping children to fit a rigid definition of what a proper person should be. When we trace each idea together, a clear pattern emerges. Stillness trained the body. Silence shaped the voice. Discipline molded behavior. Uniforms erased difference. Public correction enforced fear. Authority figures reinforced control. Even the definition of success was built around obedience rather than understanding. Step by step, childhood was narrowed into something manageable, predictable, and quiet. What makes this history so compelling is not just how strict it was, but how normal it felt at the time. These classrooms were praised, defended, and replicated because they aligned perfectly with Victorian values. Control was seen as care. Restraint was seen as virtue. And education was seen as a process of correction rather than discovery. Looking back now, we can better appreciate how much our understanding of childhood has changed. Today, we recognize curiosity, movement, and emotion as essential parts of learning. We understand that mistakes are not failures, but pathways to growth. The contrast helps us see how education evolves alongside society itself. Stories like this remind us that classrooms are never neutral spaces. They reflect what a culture believes about children, authority, and the future. By understanding where these ideas came from, we gain clearer insight into why modern education continues to wrestle with questions of control versus creativity, order versus individuality. Thank you for spending this time with me, and for stepping quietly into a classroom from another century. If you enjoyed this story and enjoy thoughtful, slow-burn history like this, feel free to stay with the channel, and I will see you in the next one.